I'm Grant Walker. Welcome to Last Call for Tuesday the 2nd of June. I'll be back with Heads Up Wednesday, 10 a.m. To the dairy industry, the first receivers report for Awarua Farms reveals a $12 million debt under a general security arrangement. The company is owned by Marlborough dairy farmer Philip Woolley, who placed Awarua Farm in voluntary receivership in late 2014. He took the action after losing a High Court appeal over a conviction for dirty dairying. The High Court upheld enforcement orders by the Marlborough District Council confirmed by the Environment Court. The enforcement orders required destocking of the dairy farm. The orders were issued because of overflows of effluent from 700 cows on the low-lying farm over a prolonged period. Receivers say they expect to satisfy all debts. The report states properties have a book value of $13 million. It says the receivers David Roscoe and David Simpson of Grant Thornton say, indeed, we expect there will be a significant surplus when the restructuring has been completed. Mr. Woolley's dairying operation at Awarua Farm near Tuamarina was the subject of Environment Court enforcement orders preventing Mr. Woolley from milking on Awarua Farm until its effluent managing system was upgraded. Mr. Woolley appealed to the High Court but was unsuccessful. The council is seeking costs for the High Court appeal and an earlier attempted stay of the enforcement orders. In market news, sharebroker Craig's Investment Partners has been fined $30,000 and censured by the Stock Exchange's Markets Disciplinary Tribunal for failing to identify retail client trading orders properly to the market. The tribunal said the breaches were a serious matter. It said the provisions relating to the reporting of trading data are of critical importance for the integrity of the market because they allow NZX to carry out its statutory obligations, including the monitoring obligations in respect of potential market misconduct such as insider dealing and market manipulation. A breach of these rules can bring NZX and the market into disrepute. The tribunal said it was particularly concerned about Craig's conduct because it had been warned about its non-compliance 2 years earlier. Between April 2013 and September 2014, Craig's entered retail client orders flagged as wholesale as multiple orders or with custody shareholder numbers rather than with the correct common shareholder number.
NBR Radio on Tuesday the 2nd of June. I'm Andrew Patterson and with me is Calida Smiley. Hi there, Calida.
Hi.
Now, the new electricity company today called Utilise launching. It targets small and medium-sized businesses. What makes Utilise different?
Well, the market is pretty crowded, but this company is targeting small and medium-sized businesses, especially those which use most of their electricity at night or the weekend, such as restaurants, or those that need their power 24/7, such as supermarkets. It's writing them customised plans because of the smart meter technology which is being put in place up and down the country, and that means that the power company can tell exactly when the customer is using their electricity. So if it's at off-peak times, they get charged off-peak rates.
So a really good opportunity for companies to take advantage of that price differential. But this is actually becoming quite a crowded space, isn't it? It's not an original idea.
Yeah, the market is pretty crowded. And I think the Electricity Authority said that last year medium-sized retailers are gaining 40,000 new customers and the large retailers are losing a small percentage of their customers. But still, the big five retailers have about a 96% market share, so they're still got most of the market there.
So you've got all of these small little operators competing over a very small slice of the market. Is there likely to be a tipping point, do you think, where they are able to aggressively take market share off the larger companies?
I'm not sure if there'll be a tipping point. I think it might be a gradual thing. But I know the big retailers are still clawing back as much as they can from each other and these smaller players. But Utilise says it's the first to target SMEs this way, and it aims to sign up about 50,000 of those businesses in the next 3 years.
So what else is interesting about this development?
Well, the company, it buys from the spot market and stores the energy in generators which are owned by its parent company, which is based in Taranaki. And then this company is owned by a Canadian company. And I did ask Utilise Executive Director Simon Young whether that's an issue that his profits are all going overseas. And he said that he hasn't experienced that as an issue from his customers so far.
Any idea how you think the bigger companies are going to respond? And how are they responding at the moment? Are they taking a bit of a wait-and-see attitude? And they'll respond, I guess, more aggressively when they see more of their market share disappearing?
Yeah, I would say that. So I'm sure they're keeping a very close eye on all this at the moment. But yeah, it'll be interesting to keep an eye on in the next year or two.
Absolutely. All right, and we'll follow developments with interest. Kalida Smiley with us on NBR Radio. Thanks for joining us.
NBR Radio with Bayleys, New Zealand's leading commercial real estate company.
To the Chinese economy. Experts have revised their GDP growth forecasts for China, citing a projected drop from 7.3 to 7.1% growth for 2015. HSBC's chief economist for China, Qiu Hongbin, says the deterioration of China's external demand is a key reason the bank cut its China forecasts. Mr. Hongbin says export growth has been weaker than expected so far this year, which is a reflection of softer external demand. As a result, HSBC has lowered its 2015 export forecast to 4.2%, a steep drop from the previous 7.1% forecast. He says much of the weakness has been anticipated as it stems from a prolonged industrial and manufacturing slowdown. Mr. Hongbin says that after a volatile performance due to Chinese New Year distortions, export growth in April fell by 6%, while imports contracted 16%. Year-to-date, exports grew by only 2%. But he says this is not a problem that is unique to China. Export growth across the region has decelerated sharply in the first 4 months of 2015, he says, with leading indicators suggesting little sign of a rebound in the months ahead. He says this may reflect the softness of US growth this year. HSBC US economists have recently cut their 2015 GDP growth forecast to 2.5% from 2.9%. Yesterday, rules came into effect that saw duties on consumer goods such as clothes and cosmetics slashed by half on average. Experts said the cut in tax was a response to the slow economic growth, which slid to 7% year-on-year for the first quarter of this year, its worst performance in 6 years. Earlier this year, the People's Bank of China cut its benchmark interest rates by 25 basis points, bringing it down to 5.35%. This was on the back of a previous rate cut in late November last year and following PBOC slashing the reserve requirement ratio. Although many China watchers say this added stimulus proves China is slowing down, University of Auckland Asian Studies Professor Paul Clark told NBR these moves by the central bank helps to reflect a shift from a dependence on exports to an emphasis on domestic consumption in China. He said there is a desire to generate more economic growth from within China. Given there are 1.4 billion people in the country, it's perfectly possible to do that. In business news, Hallaby Holdings Managing Director John Williamson says the $30 million sale of the Eldex packaging business is an excellent one and gives the company more capital for other acquisitions. Eldex's sale price was about Hallaby's carrying value after transaction costs. Mr. Williamson says the business was sold at a very good earnings multiple compared with the 5 times EBITDA Hallaby paid for 2 automotive businesses earlier this month. The packaging division's earnings before interest, tax, depreciation and amortisation in the year ended June last year was $3.6 million, although EBITDA in the 6 months ended December fell to $1.6 million from $2.1 million in the previous first half. Eldex was sold to Coverus, one of the world's largest plastics packaging and coating businesses. Eldex hadn't been for sale, but other interested parties had also contacted Hallaby recently. Mr. Williamson says what had attracted Coverus was Hallaby committing to building a food-grade manufacturing facility in Christchurch, which is due to be completed later this year. One of the reasons the division's earnings fell in the first half was manufacturing inefficiencies from its ageing existing plant. Coverus will be an excellent owner of Eldex and for its staff because it has a much bigger vision for the business, Mr. Williamson says. Eldex, Hallaby's smallest division, was a long way from meeting Hallaby's $20 million annual EBITDA target for its divisions, according to Mr. Williamson. Both the Eldex sale and the 2 recent purchases demonstrate its business as usual at Hallaby, and he isn't being idle, despite the fact he plans to leave the company after the annual shareholders meeting in October. Forsyth Barr estimates Hallaby could spend about $70 million on acquisitions from existing debt facilities to take gearing to 40%. The company's gearing target is up to 45%. Mr. Williamson says Hallaby has a number of potential purchases in its sights, but is often targeting family-owned companies, which can take some time to make decisions. Another division that clearly doesn't fit Hallaby's strategy is the footwear retailing business Hannah's and Number One Shoes, which earned less than $1 million in EBITDA in the 6 months ended December. Mr. Williamson wouldn't be drawn on the footwear division's future. Banking news. ANZ Bank was again the biggest winner in the mortgage market in the March quarter. It accounted for 40.5% of new lending by the big four banks and the government's Kiwibank compared to its market share of just over 32%. New Zealand's biggest bank lent a whopping $1.28 billion in net new mortgages in the 3 months ended March, taking its mortgage book to $61.96 billion. That's based on figures released by the big four banks and Kiwibank in their quarterly disclosure statements. The 5 banks lent an additional $3.15 billion in the 3 months. ANZ's market share had been steadily declining ever since 2003 when it took over the National Bank, and it appeared to all but shut up shop during the depths of the global financial crisis. However, that changed dramatically from mid-2012 after the National Bank business had been fully integrated and it stopped using that brand. ANZ also became much more aggressive in its marketing of home loans. By contrast to ANZ in the latest quarter, Westpac saw its market share slip, accounting for a little less than 15% of new lending compared with its market share of 21.2%. Westpac lent an additional $465 million in the quarter, taking its mortgage book to $40.62 billion. Both ANZ and Westpac continue to shrink their lending to people with less than a 20% deposit. Such lending by ANZ shrank $357 million in the latest quarter, while its lending to those with bigger deposits grew $1.63 billion. Westpac's lending to those with small deposits fell $148 million, and its lending to those with bigger deposits rose $613 million. As previously reported, ASB and Kiwibank both increased their market share in the 3 months ended March, while Bank of New Zealand was the other big loser.
NBR Radio. Free to air online with business news you can use.
To crowdfunding. A secondary market for equity crowdfunded companies' investors to sell and buy shares could soon be up and running. Snowball Effect has just spent 6 weeks validating its proposed design with the market, running it past companies, investors, brokers, the NZX and investment bankers. Although Snowball has not yet made a final determination as to whether it will go ahead, the launch date will be driven by demand from companies. Snowball platform and investor growth head Josh Daniel says we could finish building the product and be ready to go in 2 months if there's sufficient demand. Snowball's proposed design for its secondary market will be for short intervals each year to concentrate the trading and extra work involved. For a seller, the process will be similar to TradeMe's with either a buy now price or an auction with a reserve price. Mr. Daniels says we expect that our companies would want 1 trading period per year. We think this period trading process will be low cost and efficient for companies and will provide greater liquidity for investors as the trading is concentrated in a short period. The secondary market does not necessarily require Financial Markets Authority approval, depending on which regulatory channel Snowball decides to go down. Mr. Daniels says investors have been positive about Snowball's proposed market design and there is demand for it. He said, however, companies that have done Snowball raises haven't had new shareholders banging on their doors wanting liquidity. That's good because investors shouldn't expect liquidity with unlisted equities. He said, we think a secondary market will become more relevant for Snowball companies as time goes on, and we think it will have a positive impact on our primary market by making unlisted equities more appealing to a wider range of investors. He said, we're not making a song and dance about our secondary market because it would be thinly traded, so it would not necessarily be easy to sell shares. We don't want investors to have overblown expectations of the liquidity that would result. To the dairy industry, dairying consultant Alison Dews is warning of bank foreclosures on many intensified farms in the wake of reduced dairy company payouts. Fonterra has issued its 2015-16 Farmgate milk price forecast of $5.25 per kg of milk solids, and cut its forecast for the 14-15 season, which ended on Sunday, by 10 cents to $4.40 a kg. Ms. Dews told NBR, a forecast of mortgagee sales is something many analysts and forecasters have been reluctant to enunciate. She says no one wants to talk about it, but our models show most dairy operations require a payout of $6 to service debt. It's a national conversation we need to have. Ms. Dews says the reduced dairy payouts have major implications for farm investment, especially in irrigation. The large number of South Island farmers who have converted to dairying in recent times are most exposed. For example, the stored Ruataniwha Dam, which the Hawke's Bay Regional Council has been promoting and funding, would require returns of $7.50 to $8.50 to break even, she says. Ms. Dews says it's flawed thinking. We haven't been focusing on returns on capital and across land uses. We've only been talking about growth returns. Dairy New Zealand scientist John Roach has found intensification of the dairy sector, with its increasing reliance on imported feed and larger herds, has not increased profits for the average farmer. Instead, it's left their businesses at greater risk now dairy prices are collapsing. Dr. Roach found the average herd size in New Zealand has increased by 100 cows since the early 2000s, as farmers tried to cash in on higher milk prices. But farmers who increased their herd size did not end up any better off. Ms. Dew says the dairy industry encouraged milk production growth over profit and resilience, and it was time dairy industry leaders took some responsibility for those messages during the past decade. Ms. Dew has grave concerns about what will happen in the dairy industry over the next 18 months, with low prices hitting highly geared farmers. She says more production is not necessarily aligned with more profit or business resilience. Ms. Dew said dairy farmers had few options to reduce their herd sizes. She said you can't just go and sell a whole lot of cows now because we've actually got a spring tide of cows inside the country because everybody has thought about destocking. Her warnings come as the government pumps a further $25 million of budget funding to boost the Irrigation Acceleration Fund. The financial strictures facing farmers raises the question of whether there's any point in employing the funds for unaffordable schemes. The announcement also comes as compliance by dairy farmers in irrigated areas such as Mid-Canterbury Falls. Federated Farmers and Irrigation New Zealand have welcomed the new funding. The fund was set up in 2011 with $35 million of taxpayer funding. In the year ending September 2014, the fund gave out $27 million to Hurunui Water Project, Ruataniwha Water Storage Optimisation and Tukituki Strategy Implementation, Taurus Water, Wairarapa Water Use Project, Hunter Downs Irrigation, and Central Plains Water Stage 1. Meanwhile, the Opua Dam at Fairlie, South Canterbury, is proving less reliable than originally claimed. This year, the dam became a dust bowl as it dried up and irrigation restrictions came into play. Last week, Environment Canterbury issued a special direction allowing Opua Water Limited to maintain a minimum 3.5 cubic metres per second in the outflowing Opihi River, down from the normal 4.5 cubic metres per second to allow the dam to refill.
NBR Radio, Tuesday the 2nd of June. I'm Andrew Patterson, talking technology with NBR's technology reporter Chris Keel. Hi, Chris.
Hi, Andrew.
So we're talking Windows today, and the Windows 10 now seems to be on the way, and everybody's going to get bugged about an upgrade.
It is. Soon you're going to see a little notice in your system tray, if you haven't already, nagging you to upgrade to Windows 10, which will be free from July 29.
Yeah, I noticed mine there this morning. What is it going to mean, actually, in terms, because, I mean, Microsoft have had all kinds of problems in the past with some of these upgrades not meeting expectations. Do you think they'll finally get it right with Windows 10?
Well, it's the same old story that they're, to a degree, they're their own toughest competition. We had people who stuck to Windows XP and some who still stick to Windows XP, 13 years old. At the moment, the new XP really is Windows 7. It does all that a lot of consumers and a lot of business people want. They're quite happy with it. And when they saw Windows 8 with its live tiles and the start button gone, they just got culture shock and they said, no thanks.
Freaked them out.
So what Microsoft's done with Windows 10, there's no Windows 9 for mysterious marketing reasons, is that they've actually taken a step back and they've returned the start menu. It's not quite the old start menu, but it looks a lot more familiar, so it might encourage some of those Windows 7 people to move.
And what fundamentally is the difference, do you think, about this platform? What do you think it's trying to achieve that perhaps it hasn't been able to achieve previously?
Yeah. What Microsoft is trying to achieve is that it wants the same interface, this is with these tiles rather than icons, over desktop, tablet and smartphone. So the three devices all have an OS that looks very similar, and the people who make software, it's very easy for them to make the same app that runs on a PC, tablet or smartphone. And that's a great aim for Microsoft, but a lot of Microsoft's users, they're using an Android smartphone, say, or an Apple iPad, and they don't particularly want to see live tiles over each device. So in a way, Microsoft's sort of too late to the mobile party because people have already got Apple or Android mobiles, and it's also too early in that its tile interface sort of has freaked people out a little bit.
How much testing have they done? Have they indicated prior to this? Because they really have to get 10 right, don't they?
They've done tons of stability testing, and they said today around 4 million people have already downloaded it and installed it. I'm one of them, and it's been very stable. It's connected to our network, works with our printer and so forth. So from the stability point of view, it all seems good to go.
All right, and we should expect the upgrade to occur in the next 6 weeks or so, isn't it?
Yeah. And for people who are on Windows 8, they'll see a few cool new things. The charms are gone. There's an action centre that makes it easier to do settings, and Cortana, which is the Microsoft's version of Siri, which has been on their phones. It's going to make the jump to the desktop, and it's pretty good, but they haven't optimised it to the Kiwi accent like Apple recently did for Siri, so still a little bit touch and go at times.
Vista users miss out, I understand.
They do.
It's going to be a sore point, isn't it?
Another reason it was a mistake to get Vista.
Thanks for joining us, talking technology with Chris Keel on NBR Radio.
NBR Radio. With Clooney Restaurant now offering Auckland's most exclusive private dining room. NBR Radio.
In market news, Spark New Zealand, formerly Telecom Corp, plans to buy back as many as 40 million shares on market for up to 100 million this year after a series of asset sales left its balance sheet under-leveraged. The buyback aims to return Spark's gearing to a more appropriate level after the sale of Telecom Rentals and its share of Telecom Cook Islands, the Auckland-based company said in a statement. The telecommunications service retailer seeks to maintain an A-band credit rating with Standard & Poor's and has previously said it intends to keep net debt at a ratio of 1.5 times earnings before interest, tax, depreciation and amortisation. The maximum value and number of shares Spark plans to buy implies an average price of $2.50, a discount to the $2.765 the stock traded at before the announcement. Spark has rated an average hold based on 9 analyst recommendations compiled by Reuters, with a median target price of $2.94. Spark shares rose 0.5% to $2.78 on the NZX today and have dropped 11% this year. First New Zealand Capital will act as Spark's broker in the buyback. To local body politics, the Rotorua Pro-Democracy Society may seek a judicial review following Rotorua Lakes Council's decision to allow unelected Te Arawa-affiliated members be nominated for its key committees. Councillors last week voted 8-5 to allow 2 Te Arawa representatives with voting rights on its Strategy, Policy and Finance Committee, as well as its Operations and Monitoring Committee. The Te Arawa Partnership Model, which was originally proposed by the Council in May 2014, underwent a 7-week public consultation process that attracted more than 1,800 submissions. More than 250 people attended the May 26 extraordinary meeting, with about 130 attendees in the council chamber, while the remainder watched proceedings from nearby committee rooms where screens were set up to watch the live stream event. Society Secretary Reynold McPherson says the council had adjusted the rules for the 2 committees at the 11th hour so that they will only have recommending powers. He says, however, if the council decides it's not going to accept the recommendations from one of these 2 committees, they will only have the power to turn it back to that committee for reconsideration, so it's largely a cosmetic adjustment. Dr McPherson says the society, 4 members of which are also Rotorua councillors, campaigned against the partnership model for 11 months, even though they knew they were outnumbered on council. He added that the analysis of one of those councillors, Rob Kent, concluded that public submissions on the model were split 50-50 and that in recent months the council repeatedly violated the special consultative procedure it was required to adhere to under the Local Government Act 2002. 2 weeks ago, Council Chief Executive Jeff Williams publicly recommended the 4 councillors either resign from the Rotorua Pro-Democracy Society or else not participate in the May 26 vote, a move dismissed by Dr McPherson as an attempt to intimidate councillors. An NBR online poll taken on the day showed that 70% of respondents believe the society members should stick to their guns and vote on the Te Arawa Partnership Model, while 30% of respondents said they should not vote. And now a market update. Precinct Properties New Zealand, which raised $174.1 million in March to help fund major developments, sold a Wellington building in the Central Business District for $36.1 million, just below book value, and has affirmed its earnings forecast for the 2015 financial year. Auckland-based Precinct sold 80 The Terrace, valued at $37.1 million as at December 31st, to an unidentified private investor and will use the proceeds to repay bank debt, which will trim its bank gearing ratio to about 18%, it said in the statement. As at March 31, Precinct's gearing ratio was at 19.1%. Chief Executive Scott Pritchard said following the departure of major occupier AXA in 2013, the building was largely vacant. At that time, we committed to upgrade the office levels in the lobby and have since completed 6,000 square metres of new leasing, increasing occupancy from 40% in early 2014 to 100% now. This has enabled us to achieve the sale outcome announced today. In February, the company said short-term earnings may be hit by efforts to trim debt, but that a higher quality portfolio would deliver strong results over a longer period. The sale is Precinct's latest bid to shrink its property footprint in Wellington and expand its presence in Auckland, where it sees wider growth opportunities. As at March 31st, Precinct's weighting to Auckland was 58% by value. Separately, Precinct affirmed annual earnings guidance of about 6.1 cents per share before performance fees and an annual dividend payout of 5.4 cents per share. Precinct's board declared a third-quarter dividend of 1.35 cents per share plus imputation credits of 0.3754 cents payable on June 4. As at March 31st, the company's total assets were valued at $1.66 billion, and its portfolio had a 98% occupancy rate with a 5.1-year weighted average lease term. The shares fell 1.3% to 1.105 and have declined 5.2% this year. The stock is rated an average hold based on 6 analyst recommendations compiled by Reuters with a mean target price of $1.15.
Join NBR's Intelligent Business Network today. www.nbr.co.nz/subscribe.
NBR Radio, Tuesday the 2nd of June. I'm Andrew Patterson. Welcome to Property Talk. With me, Sally Lindsay and Chris Hutching. Welcome to you both.
Good morning.
Chris, to you first. Suggestions that rural property, as a result of this cut in the Fonterra payout forecast, is potentially going to have some widespread implications down the track, particularly with foreclosures. What are you making of it?
Well, it's a kind of an unpleasant reality that's just, I think people are starting to stare it in the face finally. The agencies, of course, have been keen to downplay it, but we had a couple of farm consultants who came out at the end of last week saying, look, at these current prices, these dairy payout prices, we're going to see some pain and we're going to see some foreclosures, that is, mortgagee sales. Now, that, if it comes to pass, will of course affect regional economies. It'll have some big implications for the government. I suppose we'd all hope that the dairy prices don't fall to such a degree that this continues for too long, but it's next year when this is probably going to become apparent.
And this has some implications too around the funding mechanisms for irrigation schemes.
Well, obviously, if there's less money around in the rural sector, there's not going to be there aren't going to be farmers that are throwing money at big sort of schemes, especially if they're a little bit expensive. In fact, most of them are overly expensive, they're unaffordable, which is why we have to, or is why the government feels that it has to put taxpayer money into it with its Irrigation Accelerator Fund. But even that is really only kind of a starter fund, even though we're talking about millions of dollars. So it's very hard to know. At the same time, this morning, the Central Plains Water, which is one that's underway at the moment, it's got its first stage done. They're being pretty bullish and brave about it, and they say that they're going ahead with stage 2, which is kind of interesting in that one of the subcontracting companies that supplies the pipes has just gone into receivership. So I'm not quite sure exactly where they're going to replace that company, but there we are. They're being very bullish about it. But as far as I think things like Ruataniwha Dam and the Hawke's Bay, I just can't see that happening for many years, if at all.
All right, Sally, you've been looking at this issue about council competing against the private sector when it comes to events infrastructure.
Yes, the Auckland Chamber of Commerce has had 40 complaints from businesses about the RFA's buying of equipment and undercutting them in events around Auckland. The Regional Facilities Auckland owns a lot of event centres around the city, and it has bought $12 million worth of equipment, hired a Australian-based caterer called Spotless, who've got a brand called Epicure, and they are providing all the food at these facilities and cutting out clients from making their own choices according to these businesses. Mr Barnett has asked the Chief Executive of Auckland Council, Stephen Town, to have an urgent look at this mess and to see what can be done to sort it out. The RFA says this is not true. It has bought equipment, but it's not undercutting people, and it's offering services that other regional facilities offer. And in fact, it's handed out about $2.28 million, and it's been spent across multiple suppliers for additional items during their events. Whether this can be resolved is not an easy issue to answer. This seems to be a lot of council businesses now going out on their own and using their own resources to buy equipment and then undercutting local businesses. Is this sort of thing happening in Christchurch, Chris?
Well, possibly not quite as directly as you're talking about. I'm presuming that you're talking about, you mentioned before, things like lighting and that sort of material.
Yes, but they've hired lots of other stuff, bought other stuff as well, like temporary grandstands and marquees, plastic flooring, audio-visual equipment, and all that sort of stuff. And they're hiring it out at rates 30 to 50% below market.
Well, that's obviously something that would need to be looked at. We have some council businesses here, but I don't think they're competing quite on the level that it sounds as though they are in Auckland. And obviously it comes down to this argument about would these things be provided anyway, and this is what the councils often say, look, you wouldn't have anything. But, once you start to sort of step into these things and you become a major player, that's when you start to knock others out of the game.
Absolutely, and becomes an issue too, doesn't it? Just simply by virtue of the size of the council's operation versus individual private sector operators.
Exactly. Barnett reckons that if they were a private business, they'd be operating at a loss. That is, the council, regional facilities, would be operating at a loss because of the charges they're able to make.
This is the other issue, isn't it, Sally? A lot of these things are actually running on ratepayer subsidies, and we're just not quite sure whether we're getting value for money, because if it's not contestable, how can you know? We do have an organisation that's designed to boost the economy down here called Canterbury Development Corporation. Well, goodness me, who knows what they do? They seem to duplicate a lot of what other agencies like MB does, and that's Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment, if that's not an oxymoron, and Chamber of Commerce, which has also got these kinds of databases too. So you wonder, is this really necessary? Hard to know. They're also intermediaries with funding for startups. Well, we have a lot of that coming through MB2 and Callaghan Innovation. You just kind of wonder, whether we're creating jobs for people to disseminate this kind of funding.
All right, Chris, and staying with you, let's talk about Kate Wilkinson being appointed as an Environment Court Commissioner. What are you making of that appointment?
Well, I sort of thought, maybe this is a little bit of a reward for Kate being a loyal national person and not kicking up too much of a fuss when she was obviously someone else took over her electorate last time. So she's been made what they call a commissioner of the Environment Court, and a commissioner is somebody with legal or semi-legal, if she is a lawyer, I believe, legal background, and they assist the judge. Sometimes I think they even maybe sit on certain things on their own. So what's the objection? Well, Labor says, the Attorney General, Shadow Attorney General David Parker, Labor, he says it's wrong in principle because it's getting a little bit close to the judiciary being interfered with by the legislature, which is Parliament. So he's saying, look, she was a member of this government until very recently, a member of Parliament, and now she's jumped over to being a member of the judiciary. And she will be dealing with some of the issues that the recent Parliament passed, some of the resource management issues. So she'll be effectively helping to interpret for the court some of these changes that went on when she was in government, and David Parker says, look, this is too close. The separation's not far enough.
Are you aware of precedent for this politically in the past?
I can't tell you that. I can't think of one. It doesn't mean to say there's not, but I can't recall one that's been quite like that. Although we do have a city councillor here, Sue Wells, who was training, I think she's a former city councillor, and she was trained to become a commissioner as well, although, of course, she wouldn't have been a member of parliament, so it's not quite the same sort of issue, I don't think. So I can't recall it, no.
It's going to be an interesting one to follow. Sally, you've been looking at litigation funding as well too. This is an issue which seems to be gaining increasing prominence at the moment.
Yes, it is, because there's a lawsuit coming up for $100+ million against cladding manufacturers, mainly centred around the leaky homes crisis that has hit New Zealand over the past decade or so. The problem is there's no legislation in New Zealand about litigation funding. There was a bill introduced into Parliament in 2008 and it actually has stalled. Nothing has happened with it. So to get litigation funding to fund these big cases is actually quite difficult in New Zealand, because not only do you have to persuade the litigation funder that the case is big enough, there's going to be enough claimants, but also they look at our law, and as there is none, it just actually puts a lot of litigation funders off. At the moment, Adina Thorne, who's leading the case against the cladding manufacturers, has managed to get Harbour Litigation, a British-based company, which is one of the biggest in the world, to take this on. They've said on principle they will, and there's just a few details to be sorted out about who's going to be invited to join the case. But talking to her, she said it has been a massive job to get someone to do this case. And unlike Australia and Canada, where litigation funding is an accepted practice, there's a lot of class action suits, and they've got rules and regulations. The courts have drawn them up. They've got case precedents over the years and all that. We've got nothing. So it's going to be interesting to see whether this case can actually jog the government into doing anything and progressing the bill that's been in the House for a long time. Slater
and Gordon have been one of the big prominent law firms in Australia in this area, haven't they?
Yes, and there is one litigation funder in New Zealand. It's a small company, and it's owned by private businessmen, and they're together with an Australian litigation funder, but they've only got a $15 million fighting fund, so that's very small, and it wouldn't fund a case like this one against the cladding manufacturers. So that's why you have to go overseas and get the bigger funders.
All right, we'll leave it there. Thank you both for joining us on Property Talk today, speaking to Sally Lindsay and Chris Hutching. I'm Andrew Patterson on NBR Radio.
NBR Radio with the Property Press. It's out now to show you around.
I'm Grant Walker with Last Call. Here's what's trending on NBR Online. Z shares soar after Caltex deal. More evidence of a slowdown on the Chinese economy. Spark plans a share buyback. The Auckland Ports dispute back in court. The ANZ was the big mortgage winner in the March quarter. And Windows 10 on its way. To find out more on our stories, log on to nbr.co.nz or stay tuned. Those stories coming up next on NBR Radio. To the electricity sector. A new electricity company which targets small and medium-sized businesses launched today and aims to capture a third of its target market within 3 years. Auckland-based Utilise targets businesses which use the majority of electricity at night or the weekend, such as restaurants. It customises a plan using the customer's smart meter data, taking advantage of the lower spot market prices at off-peak times, which is 60% of a week's hours. There are about 150,000 SMEs which fall within Utilise's sites, and it aims to sign up 50,000 of those in the next 2 to 3 years. Utilise Executive Director Simon Young told NBR Radio, to date these businesses might have been on generic flat rate plans but can now benefit from smart meter technology. Customised plans had previously only been available to large industrial customers. He says, we think there's a whole lot of change about to happen. Technology change is assisting that, and the wholesale market looks markedly different from 5 years ago. The big 5 electricity generator retailers, Contact, Genesis, Meridian, Mighty River Power and Trustpower, have a 96% market share, but this will likely not always be the case. Competition regulator Electricity Authority says the large retailers lost a small percentage of their customers last year, with medium-sized retailers gaining 40,000 new customers. Despite being a freshly spawned minnow, Mr Young believes Utilise can compete with the sharks. He says, "We're finding we can compete with the bigger players pretty well. Our customised pricing gives us an advantage, and our customers tell us our pricing is competitive. There is a liquid hedged market within the industry," he says, "so you get the opportunity to play on the same playing field as the big guys. You've also got a range of improved governance procedures because of the hedged market. This is as good an opportunity I've seen in my 15 plus years working in the industry for a company like Utilise to get ahead." Utilise buys from the spot market and stores the energy in generators owned by its parent company Opunake Hydro, which is Taranaki-based and Canada-owned. To politics, newly elected Green Party male co-leader James Shaw says his job is to change the party to prepare it for government rather than opposition, massively grow party membership to reflect a broader cross-section of New Zealand society, and articulate economic policy that goes beyond both capitalism and socialism. His comments struck a different tone from female co-leader Materia Ture, who at the weekend said there would be no radical shift in direction. Buttonholed by opponents as a right-wing candidate because of his background as an international business consultant, Mr Shaw got a rousing cheer from the 250 delegates at the party's annual Congress when he told them he was not a hero of free market capitalism because free market capitalism is dead and had been since governments bailed out private sector banks in the 2008 global financial crisis. Mr Shaw said the reality of politics in the wake of the global financial crisis is that there is no longer a struggle between capitalism and socialism. What we have now is a hybrid model that takes some of the good but most of the bad elements of both systems. He said there's no name for the system that we now live under. It's not capitalism nor neoliberalism, and it's not conservationism. Nobody speaks for it, nobody voted for it. It was a product of lobbying, deals behind closed doors, and driven by polling. It is moral, he said to Applause. My opposition to our current, deliberately broken economic system is not ideological.
NBR Radio on Tuesday the 2nd of June. I'm Andrew Patterson, and joining me now, NBR's court reporter Hamish McNichol. Hi there, Hamish. You've been in court today covering the latest in the Ports of Auckland dispute, and of course the case being brought by the lobby group Urban Auckland. Just before we talk a bit about the controversy involved, what's the current status of the port extension at the moment?
Yeah, so this basically all rose up in mid-February following media reports of the fact that these two extensions to Auckland's ports, the Bledisloe Wharf, had been approved without public notification. So this group, Urban Auckland, basically had a look into it and saw that there was no notification of that and that resource consent had been granted, and they weren't too happy about that. So there's been a few protests and all sorts of pressure and public outcry and stuff like that, which ultimately resulted in April. Ports of Auckland dropped one of its 100-metre extensions, but there's sort of a compromise here, and they're going to continue building the other extension, which is called B2 and is on the eastern side, whilst they put the western one on hold until a year-long study into the port's operations is completed. So before we've even got to this court case, they have managed to stop one, but the other one's still going. So, yeah, they've already made some inroads, I suppose.
So day one of a 3-day hearing, what was the case Urban Auckland were putting to the courts today? Yeah,
it was actually, as you'd expect with this, there's a lot of public interest and there's a lot of people in the gallery, which slowly tailed off as the day went on. This is often the case with these things, but a lot of the arguments have really been foreshadowed. Urban Auckland is quite vocal about this, and so basically their lawyer, Matthew Palmer, QC, is saying that basically these proposed extensions should have been notified to the public, and so there was an error of law in granting resource consent before any public notification. And so the argument centred around this issue of controversy and how controversial or contentious these extensions have been. So they've been sort of mooted since about 2013, and he was basically saying that back then there was a whole lot of controversy surrounding them. So why would the council and the Ports of Auckland now think that there wouldn't be controversy with them second time around? Because he's arguing that if there is controversy, and if he can establish that there is a controversy surrounding these extensions, then there has to be a public notification process, because that can help add value into the whole decision-making thing. Because, if you're upset about something, then you can make a submission on it, and then that gives the council consideration. And these are things like the View, and they're worried, Urban Auckland specifically is worried about the damage that it could do to the Waitemata Harbour and things like that.
So effectively they're arguing that the public have been shut out of the input process into this decision.
Yeah, and they're saying that because it's such of such high public interest, and so has been so controversial in the past and is even controversial now that it's come out, they're saying, well, surely the public should have a right to be notified on that.
We haven't heard from Council or Ports of Auckland, but how are they likely to defend their position?
Yeah, so Matthew Palmer has indicated that his arguments will finish today, and then tomorrow we're going to be hearing from Auckland Council, and they've brought in Alan Galbraith QC as their lawyer. So he's going to be making submissions tomorrow, and then Ports of Auckland, who are represented by Jim Farmer, another QC, will be heard on Thursday, which it should all be wrapped up by. So basically their argument is going to be the opposite, and that they didn't need to publicly notify on this issue because the extension plans were within an already existing gambit that they didn't have to notify on. So because, of course, the Auckland Council is the 100% owner of Ports of Auckland. So,
and just out of interest, do you know who's funding the Urban Auckland case?
No, I don't actually. There's a lot of them in court today, but yeah, they've described themselves as a not-for-profit public interest society. So I'm not exactly sure who their funders are or how that all works, but there's 3 QCs in court, so it's certainly a bit of money being flung around.
They don't turn up for sort of chump change, do
No,
they?
exactly.
All right, so we'll hear more on day 2 of the hearing tomorrow. Thanks for joining us today, Hamish McNichol.
NBR. With a National Business Review smartphone subscription, you can read or listen to the latest from NBR online. And for a limited time, it's free. Join NBR's Intelligent Business Network today and get free smartphone access to NBR online until August 31st. NBR doesn't do sport, weather or horoscopes, just timely, relevant, useful and insightful business news. So for business news you can use for free, visit nbr.co.nz/free.
To operating systems, Microsoft says Windows 10 will be available from July 29 in 190 markets, including New Zealand. As expected, the new operating system will be a free upgrade to customers running Windows 7 and Windows 8.1. Microsoft says more than 4 million people worldwide have installed the pre-release version of Windows 10. NBR's technology editor is one of them. He says it's been stable and mostly bug-free since the new year. Windows 10 includes a number of new features, but the one most users will welcome is the return of the Start menu, which was zapped from Windows 8 as Microsoft moved to a more touchscreen-friendly tile interface that's similar across Windows 10 PCs, tablets, and smartphones. Microsoft will start what Computer World US calls a NAG campaign from July 29. A new icon will appear on your PC's system tray with the message at Windows 10 app, which will provide an easy path to follow for getting your upgrade underway. Microsoft New Zealand Marketing and Operations Director Fraser Scott is forecasting hundreds of thousands more new Windows devices to ship to New Zealand market this year. Mr. Scott says there are currently 2 million devices in New Zealand running either Windows 7 or 8.1, whose owners will be eligible for the free upgrade offer. To the market, Z Energy shares soared more than 21% after the company announced plans to buy the Caltex chain of petrol stations and other assets from Chevron for $785 million. The shares jumped as high as $6.19 from $5.10 on Friday, as investors eyed the promise of the purchase adding 34% to per-share earnings from day one. That's before synergies worth between $15 to $25 million to be realised from the year ending March 2017. The biggest obstacle to Z realising its plans is that the Commerce Commission will need to approve the deal. Z is targeting completion by November, but has contingency plans allowing for it to take until the end of March next year. Z's chief executive Mike Bennett says he's confident his company can satisfy the corporate regulators' likely concerns and that Chevron could have chosen other sale avenues if it had had concerns about the regulatory process. Mr. Bennett says we wouldn't be doing what we're doing if we weren't confident that this is in the interest of all stakeholders. He told NBR he wouldn't say he was absolutely sure of getting regulatory approval, but says our application is reasonable. It's very easy for people to look at a 49% market share and think that's what it's all about. But it does come down to individual market, both regionally and in different products. Chevron also supplies other brands as well as Caltex, which then compete against Caltex. Mr. Bennett says there are over a dozen brands in the retail area in New Zealand. One argument Z will be using with the competition watchdog is that it plans to bring Chevron's call centre in the Philippines back to New Zealand, bringing jobs back into the local operations. The combined workforce will be about 400 people. Because about 25% of Z's shares are owned by offshore investors, the deal also requires a tick from the Overseas Investment Office, but that's unlikely to be more than a formality. The purchase price is 5.9 times the Chevron New Zealand business estimated replacement cost earnings before interest, tax, depreciation, amortisation and financial instruments, and 6.9 times its 5-year average historical cost epitaph. Caltex has 146 branded petrol stations throughout the country, all but 10 of them independently owned and operated, and 73 truck stops. It also owns the Challenge brand, which is operated by the rural supplies business Farmland through 90 petrol stations. One of its businesses, the sale and distribution of lubricants, will be a new business for Z. Mr. Bennett says when the oil price started plummeting last year, his company made it known it was a willing buyer if any of its rivals, which also include Mobil and BP, were interested in selling. The Z purchase doesn't include Chevron's 11.4% stake in Refining New Zealand, the nation's only oil refinery. Z owns just over 17% of the refinery. Mr. Bennett says his company intends to continue to operate the Caltex network separately from the Z stations and that each company has a distinct operating model. He says it would be nonsensical to take two strong brands and operating models and make them one. Z is targeting a November 30 completion date, but has contingency plans for the transition to drag out to the end of March next year. Mr. Bennett says he expects the Commerce Commission review will take 4 to 6 months, but could take longer, and it may also take longer for his company to be ready to complete the takeover. Z is budgeting about $41 million to cover transition costs, and that includes $9 million of additional costs if settlement is delayed until March 2016. Z is funding the purchase with existing cash, debt, and will raise about $185 million in fresh equity at the time the deal is settled, so it can keep to its credit target of 2.6 times net debt to 2015 replacement cost epitaph. To our terms of trade. The country's terms of trade rose 1.5% in the first 3 months of the year as a slump in imported petrol prices offset weaker prices for dairy exports. This halted 2 quarters of decline, but the figures lagged behind the 1.7% gain projected in a Reuters survey. The nation's terms of trade, which measures the quantity of imports the country can buy with a set amount of exports, reached a 40-year high in the second quarter of last year as a high Kiwi dollar kept import prices in check. They deteriorated in the second half of the year as dairy export prices declined and the currency fell from a post-float high on a trade-weighted basis. Westpac Banking Corp economist Michael Gordon says this bounce in the terms of trade is likely to be reversed in the next couple of quarters, given that world oil prices have risen from their lows while dairy export prices have seen renewed declines. But even so, he says, we believe the current downturn in the terms of trade is nearing its end point. If we're right, the trough in this cycle is still likely to be higher than the previous peak seen in 2011. Dairy export prices dropped 6.3% while volumes fell 2.2% in the latest quarter, leading a 3.7% decline overall in export prices. Export volumes rose 1.4%. Meat prices dropped 4.5% while volumes climbed 4.6% to the highest level since the series began in 1990. Prices of forest products rose 1.4% and volumes fell 4.7%. Imported goods prices dropped 5.1% in the first quarter as volumes edged up 0.1%. Petrol and petroleum product prices tumbled 29% to the lowest level since the June 2005 quarter, while the volume fell 14%. In seasonally adjusted terms, the value of exports fell 2.5% to $11.4 billion, while the value of imports declined 4.8% to $11.8 billion. The terms of trade weakened against the nation's biggest trading partners. For China, the terms of trade fell 4.4% as export prices fell 2.3%, led by dairy, and import prices rose 2.2%. Against Australia, the terms of trade dropped 7.7% as export prices fell 8.9%, led by crude oil and cheese, and import prices declined 1.2%. The terms of trade with the US fell 3.3% as export prices rose 0.3% and import prices rose 3.8%. And against Japan, they dropped 1.4% as export prices fell 4.8% and import prices declined 3.5%. That was made up for by the rest of the world, excluding the European Union, with the terms of trade jumping 18% as export prices were down 5.8% and import prices down 20%.
You're listening to NBR Radio. Upgrade to My NBR Radio with a smartphone-only subscription to NBR Online today for free and receive unlimited access to NBR Online on your smartphone until August 31st. Visit www.nbr.co.nz/free.
Let's talk advertising. Consumers are in for a sentimentality overload, with BP and Vodafone both releasing eerily similar brand ads at the same time. Both multinational companies have released ads with a common theme: a man embarking on a pilgrimage after rescuing a lost animal. Vodafone's ad features a postman rescuing a pig, and BP sports a motorcyclist who rescues a rabbit. Both show off the beauties of this country's landscape, have the characters use social media to their advantage, and are 90 seconds long, but the endings are slightly different. And I don't mean to spoil things, but in Vodafone's ad, Piggy Sue's charms are too much for her rescuer, and he ends up keeping her. BP's motorcyclist Peter ends up returning the lost rabbit to its owner. Vodafone says its ad via FCB was intended to show the breadth of its network, particularly for rural New Zealand. Vodafone's network reaches 97.5% of where Kiwis live, work and play, and delivers superfast 4G to over 80% of the country. Meanwhile, BP says its ad via Ogilvy and Mather shows the strength of its service station network. The strategy is about recognising the myriad of individual ways people make the most of their time at BP. Make the most of our network, food, coffee and, of course, fuel. The petrol provider says further iterations will be rolled out in the near future. Vodafone released its ad on the 21st of May and BP's came out 9 days later. Now, if you want to check them both out, go to nbr.co.nz. To the post-budget political poll. It shows support for National and John Key is steady and that most voters had a neutral reaction to the May 21st budget. A One News Colmar Brunton poll taken May 23rd to 27 found support for National down 1 point to 48% since the previous poll mid-April. Labor was static on 31% and the Greens up 1 to 10%. Minor parties were steady. 4% said they were better off because of the budget. 72% said they were about the same. 10% said they were worse off and 14% didn't know. And despite the ponytail controversy, John Key's preferred Prime Minister rating was up 2 points to 44%. Labour leader Andrew Little slipped 2% to 9%, putting him level pegging with Winston Peters and possibly leading him to have second thoughts about giving the New Zealand First Leader a soft run in the Northland by-election. A Roy Morgan poll taken during the lead-up to the budget, as most major policy was pre-announced, along with the fact the government would miss surplus, also saw support for National holding steady.
NBR Radio, Tuesday the 2nd of June. I'm Andrew Patterson. We're talking China. Always fascinating looking at the political and economic moves within the country. And Jason Wall's with us now. Jason, hello. Let's talk about the latest news coming out of China, particularly its forecasting lower projections for its GDP growth.
Yeah, well, it's as you said, there's always something interesting to talk about China, even economically and politically. I like to focus on the economics because there's lots going on. But the latest that we've seen is HSBC have lowered their projections of GDP growth to just 7.1%. So, I mean, the big problem is China's external demand, is what they were saying, and the deterioration of that external demand. We can see that export growth has been weaker than expected. Basically, it's a reflection on softer demand from within China. But as this is happening, it's sort of happening across all of Asia, really. I mean, and what the economists were saying is that it could be as a result of a lower US GDP growth forecast.
So what's China doing to combat this problem of lower GDP growth? And it is just continually ticking down in small increments each time, isn't it?
Yeah. We saw back in earlier in the early 2000s, I think mid-2000s actually, their GDP growth was up to double digits. So at one point it was up to 13%, which is, I mean, it's massive. And we're still looking at it now. It's last year, year-end was 7%, which we look at that in New Zealand at our current 3% growth I think we are at, and we say, wow, that's fantastic, that's huge. But China looks at that and says, we're actually slowing down. I mean, they've actually done quite a bit to try and combat this. Like, for example, yesterday new tax rules came into effect, which basically cut duties on consumer goods and slashed them by half on average. So that's things from like cosmetics and clothes. And what they were aiming to do was encouraging more spending within China rather than buying online, which is almost ironic, really, when you think about that. Because when I go and buy things online, I always buy it from China. So the first question that came into my head is like, whereabouts are they buying from? But they obviously, as this is quite a policy measure to cut taxes on duties by half. So they must have been looking somewhere. I mean, look at the People's Bank of China, for example. I mean, we see that rates were cut in November last year, and then again, only a few months later in March, they were cut again. So there's only a few months between that. And then, as well as that, the reserve requirement ratio was cut, and that was, again, in an attempt to spur lending within the economy, and that would help spur some growth as well, so some spending. So there have been some steps taken to try and boost this growth number up. You'll have a lot of China watchers that say, as you said, China is slowing down. And by the numbers, it technically is. But University of Auckland Asia Studies professor Paul Clark was telling me a couple of months ago that it's basically a shifting dependence from export onto an emphasis on a domestic consumption within China. So they're really changing tact on how they are doing it. And it's not just China being, I've said it before on NBR Radio, China being the China of the world, but they're looking more inwardly focused now on how China can help China.
It's a very different focus, isn't it? And this is part of a managed approach by the government to actually take or dial back some of this economic growth a little bit, because clearly, as you said before, it was running fairly white hot before.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad you mentioned that, actually, because it's been more of what I've heard when I've been talking to people is it's been a regulated slowdown. So it means it's not something that's happened just on its own. It's been something that's been planned, because when it was up to those huge double-digit growth numbers, I mean, there was things like corruption, pollution, things like that were a really prevalent problem within China. However, now they're taking a look at it and saying, okay, we can afford to slow down just a little bit, and we can focus on some of these other problems. I mean, we can see projections for Chinese GDP growth for the next 20 years, because there are some economics whizzes out there that can sit down and calculate these things. But we see it gradually returning to a level closer to New Zealand's. So on the cards in the next 20, 30 years, we're going to see a slowdown of GDP growth. But, I mean, that doesn't necessarily mean that China's going backwards. In fact, I would argue the opposite, that it actually might be going forward.
And just briefly, of course, this isn't good news for New Zealand as a major trading partner. We've seen, obviously, the depressed current dairy price. So could we expect more of this, do you think, going forward?
Well, that's an interesting question, actually. I mean, when you look at somewhere like Australia, the answer is definitely yes, it is a bad thing for them, because there is less of an emphasis on raw commodities in China now. So they're doing less exporting from Australia. I mean, there's been the mining slowdown. When it comes to New Zealand, though, I mean, they're looking to buy. Look at it like this. You've got the middle class is growing, so they're looking for more premium products to buy. So they're going to look to places like New Zealand and say they've got some premium products. Of course, the lower milk forecast is going to have an effect, but at the same time, I mean, that's sort of volatile. It'll go up and down. But when you look at it in the very long term, you see these Chinese consumers looking for better quality products for themselves. And I think New Zealand's actually going to really benefit from that.
Jason Walls, thanks for joining us on NBR Radio.
NBR Radio. With Hotel de Brett, your home away from home, but with better service. NBR Radio.
To the honours list, New Zealand's most recognised scientist and the government's chief science advisor, Professor Sir Peter Gluckman, has received the country's highest honour. Sir Peter was yesterday made an ordinary member of the Order of New Zealand for services to the country, joining the likes of former Prime Ministers Helen Clark and Jim Bolger, opera diva Dame Kiri Te Kanawa, and athlete Sir Murray Halberg in the elite group, which is limited to 20 living persons. Also recognised in the Queen's birthday honours were 3 Dame and 3 Knight companions of the New Zealand Order of Merit. Dame Bronwyn Holdsworth of Gisborne was knighted for services to business and the arts, Dame Diane Robertson of Auckland for services to the community, and Dame Teresa Walsh of Wellington for services to sports administration. New knights include New Zealand's former UN ambassador and former Deputy Prime Minister Sir Jim Macleay, Māori Party co-founder Sir Peter Sharples, and Nelson-based fishing and dairy industry leader Sir Peter Talley. To Auckland ports. Lobby group Urban Auckland says the intense public controversy surrounding proposed extensions to Ports of Auckland's Bledisloe Wharf mean the resource consent applications should have been publicly notified. And it must have been obvious Ports of Auckland's application to extend the wharf in two places would have been controversial, attracting public submissions on the matter, the High Court at Auckland has heard. Non-profit public interest society Urban Auckland today is applying for a judicial review of Auckland Council's decisions in relation to expansion at the port it owns. Urban Auckland's lawyer Matthew Palmer QC says the case is about whether resource consent applications should be notified when there is significant public controversy about the proposal and similar proposals in the past. There has been intense public controversy about Bledisloe Wharf since 2013, he says, meaning the same could have been expected for the extensions. The controversy is important because it could therefore be expected the public would make submissions and which would provide valuable public input, he says. Mr. Palmer says controversy has been what can only be described as high. It must have been obvious, he says, that this application to extend the wharf in two places would have been controversial. Mr. Palmer says the decision to not publicly notify is one no reasonable decision-maker could have made. Urban Auckland is saying the extensions will do damage to Waitemata Harbour and block views from Queen's Wharf. The hearing is continuing before Justice Geoffrey Venning and expected to take 3 days. Auckland Council's lawyer Alan Galbraith QC will make submissions tomorrow before Ports of Auckland, represented by Jim Farmer QC, is heard on Thursday. In April, Ports of Auckland dropped one of the 100-metre extensions following public outcry and pressure from Auckland Council. Under the compromise, Ports of Auckland will continue building the eastern extension, B2, but put on hold construction of the western extension, B3, until after a year-long study into the port's operations. To the market, Z Energy shares soared more than 21% after the company announced plans to buy the Caltex chain of petrol stations and other assets from Chevron for $785 million. The shares jumped as high as $6.19 from $5.10 on Friday, as investors eyed the promise of the purchase adding 34% to per-share earnings from day one. That's before synergies worth between $15 to $25 million to be realised from the year ending March 2017. The biggest obstacle to Z realising its plans is that the Commerce Commission will need to approve the deal. Z is targeting completion by November but has contingency plans allowing for it to take until the end of March next year. Z's chief executive Mike Bennett says he's confident his company can satisfy the corporate regulators' likely concerns and that Chevron could have chosen other sale avenues if it had had concerns about the regulatory process. Mr. Bennett says we wouldn't be doing what we're doing if we weren't confident that this is in the interest of all stakeholders. He told NBR he wouldn't say he was absolutely sure of getting regulatory approval, but says our application is reasonable. It's very easy for people to look at a 49% market share and think that's what it's all about. But it does come down to individual market, both regionally and in different products. Chevron also supplies other brands as well as Caltex, which then compete against Caltex. Mr. Bennett says there are over a dozen brands in the retail area in New Zealand. One argument Z will be using with the competition watchdog is that it plans to bring Chevron's call centre in the Philippines back to New Zealand, bringing jobs back into the local operations. The combined workforce will be about 400 people. Because about 25% of Z's shares are owned by offshore investors, the deal also requires a tick from the Overseas Investment Office, but that's unlikely to be more than a formality. The purchase price is 5.9 times the Chevron New Zealand business estimated replacement cost earnings before interest, tax, depreciation, amortisation and financial instruments, and 6.9 times its 5-year average historical cost epitaph. Caltex has 146 branded petrol stations throughout the country, all but 10 of them independently owned and operated, and 73 truck stops. It also owns the Challenge brand, which is operated by the rural supplies business Farmland through 90 petrol stations. One of its businesses, the sale and distribution of lubricants, will be a new business for Z. Mr. Bennett says when the oil price started plummeting last year, his company made it known it was a willing buyer if any of its rivals, which also include Mobil and BP, were interested in selling. The Z purchase doesn't include Chevron's 11.4% stake in Refining New Zealand, the nation's only oil refinery. Z owns just over 17% of the refinery. Mr. Bennett says his company intends to continue to operate the Caltex network separately from the Z stations and that each company has a distinct operating model. He says it would be nonsensical to take two strong brands and operating models and make them one. Z is targeting a November 30 completion date but has contingency plans for the transition to drag out to the end of March next year. Mr Bennett says he expects the Commerce Commission review will take 4 to 6 months, but could take longer, and it may also take longer for his company to be ready to complete the takeover. Z is budgeting about $41 million to cover transition costs, and that includes $9 million of additional costs if settlement is delayed until March 2016. Z is funding the purchase with existing cash debt and will raise about $185 million in fresh equity at the time the deal is settled, so it can keep to its credit target of 2.6 times net debt to 2015 replacement cost EBITDA.
NBR
Radio.
Free to air online. NBR, the meeting place of intelligent business.
NBR Radio on Tuesday, the 2nd of June. I'm Andrew Patterson and talking politics with Rob Hosking. Hello, Rob.
Good afternoon, Andrew.
Let's talk about the big political announcement over the weekend. James Shaw, now the new co-leader of the Greens, taking the position ahead of Kevin Haigh, who perhaps was the obvious successor to Russell Norman. How was it that James Shaw, a relative unknown, was able to get the position over Haigh, who had a much higher profile within the party?
Well, I think that's a very interesting question, because you've got, it was a very drawn-out process where, the Greens, unlike some other parties, it's not the MPs that elect the leader, it's the wider membership. And so there was a nationwide campaign amongst the party's leaders, effectively a sort of primary, if you like. And the classic thing that happens with primaries is, in any country, is within parties, is it tends to select people at the more extremes of the party. And that hasn't happened. In fact, from very early on, it did look as if Kevin Haigh was the front runner, because he has a lot of experience in Parliament and outside Parliament, and he's very highly regarded. And James Shaw has been in Parliament since the last election, which is only a bit over 6 months, and he's fairly well known in Wellington, but he's not well known outside the Bowen Triangle. But he's shown that he's actually, firstly, he's a fairly formidable campaigner. Anyone who can take on Kevin Haigh, who's been campaigning since his teens pretty much on all sorts of things, and win, is not to be not to be taken lightly. And he's got that background of a business, working for business both here and overseas. And this has been sort of held against him in some quarters. Certainly the Green Party, the more left-wing activists, aren't too happy about that. But at the same time, he managed to persuade enough of them to make him leader. And that's quite an achievement, I think. It's going to be interesting to see where the Greens go from here, because I think it raises all sorts of issues, not just for the Greens, but for Labor and actually for National.
I was going to ask you about that, because does it mean that there are elements in the party, in the Green Party, potentially not as green on the outside as they might appear?
Well, the jibe about the Greens here and overseas for a long time has been that they're not really green, that they're watermelons. They're green on the outside and red on the insides, and that the whole green movement has been a sort of stalking horse for socialist policies that have become discredited and abandoned by most Labor parties around the world. And look, that has had a lot of validity, it has to be said. You've only got to look at the number of old-fashioned hard left activists who have come up through the Greens. But that doesn't mean the green element isn't there. And the Greens like to claim they're neither right nor left. That's always been a little self-delusional, if I can put it like that. They are left, in that they want to radically transform society in a particular way. But they're really about redefining what it means to be left-wing. And I think James Shaw is pretty much in that tradition. And that sort of means that, although some people have claimed he's some sort of stalking horse for I don't know, a sort of slightly chlorophyll-tinged version of the Business Roundtable or something, I don't know. But, because he's got that business experience, that he's some sort of, Manchurian candidate for the right wing. That's rubbish. He is very much a left winger, I guess, if we can use those terms. But he's just not necessarily particularly socialist about it.
This does create a bit of a dilemma for the Nats, though, doesn't it? Because to a certain extent, they've been able to enjoy quite a bit of political advantage by painting the Greens into a certain corner, and now you've got a co-leader actually putting out the welcome mat. How will National respond to this development?
Very carefully, because the Greens as a sort of slightly unstable, radical left political bogeyman has been very useful for the National Party. There's certainly some of the ideas that are still coming out of the Greens will alarm a lot of national voters. James Shaw is, he's spoken quite firmly in favour of taxing capital gains, for example, far more aggressively than we already do. He talks about a steady state economy, which is an interesting throwback, I think, to some of the ideas that were being put forward by Jeanette Fitzsimons when she was co-leader. That again is very much from the origins of the Green movement in notions of what's called deep ecology and things like that come out of the 70s, the whole limits to growth. Writings from that era, and he's very much sort of in that area of green policy. He's quite keen on pushing climate change and how that is dealt with. These are policies which don't go down that well with a lot of national voters. In fact, they don't go down that well with most national voters. So although there's going to be some areas they can work with each other, probably not as many as you might think, or some people might be implying. I think the other interesting thing is the impact on Labor, because firstly he's a interesting new face on the political left, so he's going to take some of their oxygen, and secondly, the other thing I find interesting is implicit in his message is we've got to work, for the Green Party. He's basically saying to Green Party members, we've got to work with National on some things to get some things done. And if you think about that, that assumes that National is going to be government for some time yet.
Indeed.
And that there's not, and so that's very much, part of his message. What I find interesting is he's got more than half the Green Party membership to agree with him on that.
Yeah, indeed. And then you've also got this interesting aspect of his appointment. For the first time, somebody with a strong business background coming in on the left. We haven't seen much of that any time recently, Rob.
No, we haven't. And that's something that means that he's basically saying, look, I can go out and I can talk to business people because I've worked with them before. He's not going to be the scary figure that Russell Norman was for business. Russell Norman was very antithetical to business groups, and I think, and vice versa. I mean, the feeling was pretty mutual on that one. And look, some of that was just plain, it wasn't even about policies. It was about different attitudes and just not talking the same language. They just couldn't get on the same wavelength. James Shaw is able to get on this wavelength at the start anyway of any interaction. Whether they stay on the same wavelength over time is another question, of course.
Well, what do you think about his ability to work with Maturia Ture? Because she hardly gave him, a welcoming ovation in response to his appointment, did she?
Well, it's interesting you say that because, there's been a number of different interpretations to the existing co-leader Maturia Ture, her response to Shaw. I think she was quite ambiguous. Some have interpreted her comments as quite effusive. She is very much, more in the sort of socialist who's found a new home in the Green movement category than Shaw is, and so there could well be some tensions there. On the other hand, they could be said to, personify the different strands within the Green movement in a slightly more stark way, if you like, than, say, looking across the aisle, John Key and Bill English represent sort of different strands within the National Party tradition. But I think, there could be some tensions there, if not with at co-lead level, then the next level down. And the other thing is the personal element here, because Shaw is very much... there's going to be a lot of focus on him in the next 6 months because he's such a new figure. And that's going to, in turn, steal some limelight from Turier. And, yeah, how that goes down at a personal level is going to be interesting to watch too.
And just finally, Rob, is this good for the Greens, do you think, long term? Because, of course, they were disappointed with the result in last year's election. They were looking for around 14% of the vote, only ended up with 11. Do you think this is going to get them a bit closer to that 14% line?
I don't know. I do wonder if, more broadly, and I've argued for this for a long time, I do think given the shifts going on in the New Zealand, not just economy, but just in New Zealand society, I think we're overdue for a political realignment on the left. I think Labour is becoming less and less connected with the way New Zealand is going. And I'm not sure that the current lineup within Labour really realises that. I think Andrew Little does, but I think most of the rest of his front bench don't. And Labour is hopelessly divided. And there's a talent problem there as well. There's a funding problem. There's a general sense that they don't actually know what they're there for anymore. The Greens actually do seem to know what they're there for. Whether you like that or not is another question. But they certainly... they're not just there for playing yet another round of political ducks and drakes and who sits around what committee at what level, which is what Labour has been doing for years, since they lost in 2008. This is, the knock-on effect, I think, from this leadership change could be quite interesting to watch.
Thanks for joining us, Rob, on NBR Radio.
NBR. Need to hire? Try our online recruitment platform. www.nbrtalent.co.nz.
To state housing, Te Runanga o Te Rarawa Chairman Hami Piripi says iwi want government to transfer state houses to them at no cost, putting them at odds with National's commitment to getting a fair and reasonable price for taxpayers as it pushes ahead with its plan to transfer 2,000 homes to community groups. We would argue that the market price is zero, the Northland iwi leader says, because the outcomes will far outweigh the cost, and the state houses up for grabs are already a very marginal operation. He says Māori want to negotiate a deal nationally as a collective of iwi because they are the best placed entities to do the business. And the best way to do it is to sponsor us into it by enabling us to utilise money we would normally have used to make a capital purchase to invest or reinvest in the sector. When asked if other community housing providers should also get state houses for free, Mr Piripi says, I can't think of any other organisation that would invest in the same way that we would and have the same sort of commitment that we have. We're prepared to co-invest. We're prepared to utilise our own assets, our own land, our own resources to continue to respond to housing needs. He acknowledges that taking over responsibility for providing housing is in the too hard basket in many ways, but iwi feel obliged to house their people. He says when the Salvation Army turn down an opportunity, then you know it's possibly a lemon. He says iwi may seek low-interest loans from government, but their starting point is the houses have no value. And for a full transcript of what Mr Piripi said on TV3's The Nation, please go to nbr.co.nz. To the telecommunications industry, Spark says it's close to launching affordable new fast wireless broadband services for people in rural areas. The service will be based on 700 MHz 4G technology, which Spark has been adding to cell towers built by Vodafone as part of the government's $360 million rural broadband initiative. Spark spent $158 million on the spectrum at the government's digital dividend auction last year, held after the analogue TV switch-off freed up airwaves. More than Vodafone or 2 Degrees. It bought the final chunk up for action for $83 million after an extended bidding war with Vodafone that drove the price well above the $22 million reserve. 700 MHz spectrum is suited for rural areas because it has a longer reach than the 1800 or 2100 MHz bands typically used in urban areas. Spark told NBR it's co-located its own antenna on 85 sites built by Vodafone under the RBI, with 40 more on the way. 2 Degrees, meanwhile, says it has only co-located on a handful of the Vodafone-constructed towers. The company says it's too expensive at $175,000 per tower and has called for a specific change as the government prepares to dole out a further $150 million for the rural rollout. Last week, Communications Minister Amy Adams revealed figures to NBR that showed uptake for the Crown's subsidies rural broadband upgrade was even lower than the urban ultra-fast broadband initiative.
NBR Radio on Tuesday the 2nd of June. I'm Andrew Patterson, and of course the big business story today, Z Energy announcing the acquisition of Caltex, owned by Chevron New Zealand. Covering the story, Jenny Ruth. Jenny, this is perhaps a little unexpected. How has the market share price reacted to the news?
Well, the $785 million purchase is a big one. It was always on the cards after the news last week that Chevron was selling out. It's just over 11% of the refining New Zealand. But what the market's reacting to is the immediate impact will be that earnings per share of Z Energy will go up by 34%, and that's before you take into account synergies, and they're estimated to be worth between $15 million and $25 million. That's from the year ending March 2017. So the shares jumped as high as $6.14, and that's from $5.10 on Friday, so a more than 20% increase. I think investors are pretty happy on the face of it.
And the super fund will be particularly pleased, won't it, because it's quite a major investor in this company?
It is a major shareholder, yes. The big problem, though, that they're going to face with this deal is getting it through the Commerce Commission. The combined Z Energy and Caltex business, or Chevron New Zealand business, will give it a 49% share of the market nationally. The Chief Executive, Mike Bennett, says that, well, not absolutely certain that he can get it through the regulator. He does think that they've got a reasonable case to make, and that 49% share nationally doesn't necessarily translate to that on a regional level. And he points out that there are, I think, 11 different petrol brands operated in New Zealand, not just Caltex and Z.
But this will end up being quite a substantial player. I think the combined operation will have around half the market.
49%, yes. That's what the outcome will be if they do get the deal done. Of course, there's always a potential that it could be eroded somewhat at the margin in different markets, because the Commerce Commission will look at individual markets throughout the country, not just the national level.
What about the absorption issue? Because Caltex does run a different model to Z. The majority of its service stations are individually owned, aren't they?
All but 10 of the 146 stations are independently owned and operated. Yes, Z's targeting the end of November to have this deal completed, but it's got contingency plans in place that it could drag out till the end of March. That could be just because of delays caused by the Commerce Commission process, or it could be that Z Energy doesn't feel it's ready to take over the business at that point. They have appointed a dedicated team. They've appointed Lindis Jones, who's currently the manager of the commercial business unit, to manage the transition of the business through this process.
Now, there's also the branding issue as well. I assume that they will continue to run Caltex as a standalone business for some time.
That definitely is the intention. They will have the right to use the Caltex brand for 2 years from the completion of the deal. However, Mr. Bennett says they could negotiate to keep the brand on longer. He's saying that at this stage it's strategically better for his company to operate the two businesses separately. They are very different business models. The Caltex stations, for example, don't have convenience stores and car washes as the Z stations do. There is some risk, though, obviously, with Caltex only owning 10 of those stations. Z, of course, owns all its stations and has much more control because of that.
And just finally, Jenny, is this a certain vindication for Mike Bennetts himself in terms of the way he has run this company and now taken it from a brand, Z Energy, that we didn't have 4 or 5 years ago to now being the dominant player in the market?
Well, I think you have to give Mr. Bennett and his team full marks for managing the business from the time they took over Shell. I mean, there's no doubt that Z Energy is one of the quality listed companies, and it's definitely got a track record. And presuming it can get through the Commerce Commission, you would back management to get the benefits that they can see from owning the Chevron New Zealand business.
Jenny Ruth, thanks for joining us.
You're listening to NBR Radio. Upgrade to My NBR Radio with a smartphone-only subscription to NBR Online today for free and receive unlimited access to NBR Online on your smartphone until August 31st. Visit www.nbr.co.nz/free.